Right now, this week, a Las Vegas courtroom is doing something hip-hop has waited 30 years for. Jury selection wrapped, opening statements have been delivered, and the murder trial of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the man accused of orchestrating the drive-by that killed Tupac Shakur in 1996, is finally underway. And the man who was sitting behind the wheel of that BMW the night Tupac was shot, the man who took shrapnel from the same gunfire, is watching all of it unfold from a cell nearly 300 miles away. That man is Marion Suge Knight, and his own story never really stopped generating headlines. It just moved somewhere quieter. This is where things actually stand for him, right now, in August 2026. Knight is currently incarcerated at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, a state prison in San Diego County, not far from the Mexican border. He's been housed there since he was sentenced back in October 2018, and according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's own inmate locator, that's still where he is today. He's serving a 28-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter, the result of a plea deal he took just before his case was set to go to trial on murder and attempted murder charges. 22 of those years came from the manslaughter conviction itself. The other 6 were added because of a third strike enhancement tied to his prior felony record, a history that stretches back to armed robbery and assault convictions from the 1990s and early 2000s. Under that sentence, his earliest possible parole date is October 2034. Eligibility isn't a promise of release. It simply means that's the earliest point at which a parole board is required to even consider his case. The case that put him there goes back to January 2015, outside Tam's Burgers in Compton. Knight had been turned away from a meeting connected to the film Straight Outta Compton, and later that day, he got into a confrontation in the restaurant's parking lot with 2 men, Terry Carter and CLE Bones Sloan, the latter a former gang member who had worked as a consultant on the movie. Surveillance video showed Knight's truck striking both men. Sloan survived. Carter, a 55-year-old businessman, did not. Knight's defense argued self-defense, that he'd been ambushed and was trying to escape. Prosecutors argued he'd deliberately run the men down out of anger. The case took nearly 4 years to resolve, and just before trial, Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter rather than risk a murder conviction and a much longer sentence. What that plea actually looks like day to day is a long way from the death row records Empire Knight once ran. Reporters who've covered his case describe a facility built around count times, structured meals, and limited movement. The same routine every long-term inmate in the California system lives inside. For Knight specifically, that routine has been complicated by health problems that have been part of the public record since at least his 2023 legal filings. According to court documents his own attorneys submitted, Knight has lost sight in one eye during his incarceration. He's also been dealing with diabetes and a history of blood clots, conditions that require consistent monitoring and that tend to become harder to manage the longer someone remains inside institutional medical care. He was 53 years old when he was sentenced. He's now in his 60s, and by the time October 2034 arrives, he'll be approaching 70. Knight's legal team hasn't simply accepted the sentence and gone quiet. Back in 2023, he filed petition, a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that his 28-year sentence should be thrown out. According to the petition, Knight claimed he'd been denied his right to represent himself, that he'd been pressured into the plea deal by an overworked public defender who was, by the court's own account, his 14th attorney on the case, and that circumstances including the COVID-19 pandemic, his permanent housing situation, and the loss of vision in one eye had made it difficult to file within the normal legal window. That petition sat for roughly 2 years before Los Angeles County Judge Laura Priver ruled on it. On March 4, 2025, according to Rolling Stone's reporting on the decision, Priver denied the petition, writing that Knight was not as isolated or as helpless to act as he wishes this court to believe. She found the filing both untimely and, in her word, insincere, noting that Knight had managed to file other motions during the same period he claimed he was unable to act. Knight's attorney, David Kenner, a lawyer with roots going back to death row records' founding years, publicly rejected the ruling, telling Rolling Stone he found the decision shocking and unconscionable, and vowing to pursue a writ of mandate in the appellate court. As of now, that ruling stands. The 28-year sentence hasn't moved. What has changed dramatically is how Knight communicates with the outside world. In October 2023, TMZ broke the news that Knight was partnering with Dave Mays, the co-founder of The Source magazine and CEO of a media company called Breakbeat Media, to launch a podcast recorded entirely from prison. They called it Collect Call with Suge Knight, a nod to the literal mechanics of how it gets made. Knight calling in on a prison phone line, with Mays and other producers recording, editing, and releasing the conversations as weekly episodes. The show debuted on Halloween 2023, with audio episodes typically dropping on Thursdays and video versions following the next day. Because prison phone access isn't something a production schedule can simply lock in, the team recorded several episodes in advance before the launch. Mays has described the goal of the project as bringing what he called a truthful and authentic hip-hop perspective to listeners, framing Knight as one of the genre's most influential business figures, regardless of where he's calling from. The content itself has been anything but restrained. On the very first episode, Knight went after Warren G and Akon by name, while also praising women in hip-hop and naming artists like SZA and Cardi B favorably. He's repeatedly claimed, across multiple episodes, that Death Row Records was taken from him fraudulently, a claim that's become something of a recurring theme on the show. He's used the platform to respond directly to smaller YouTube and podcast figures who'd been talking about him, without any way for him to answer back, effectively turning the show into a running rebuttal machine. He's weighed in on Sean Diddy Combs' federal legal troubles, telling ABC News last year that Combs should tell the real truth, and suggesting on his own podcast that he doesn't expect Combs to face the harshest possible consequences, floating theories about past cooperation with federal authorities. He's spoken about the Menendez brothers' parole fight, telling TMZ he had knowledge of prison dynamics he believed factored into the parole board's decision. And inevitably, he's talked repeatedly about the night Tupac Shakur was shot, describing helping Tupac into an ambulance and staying with him until he died at the hospital, a first-hand account he's repeated on air more than once over the past 2 years. That last thread is the one that's suddenly become the most consequential, because of what's happening in Las Vegas right now. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis was arrested in September 2023 and charged with first-degree murder in Tupac's killing, accused by prosecutors of orchestrating the 1996 drive-by shooting. Davis has pleaded not guilty and has maintained his innocence in recent interviews, even while acknowledging that he wrote about his alleged involvement in a 2019 book. His trial was delayed multiple times, first from an initial 2025 date, then pushed to February 2026, and finally to August 10, 2026, after his defense team said it needed more time to review a large volume of newly discovered evidence. That trial is now actually happening. Jury selection concluded in mid-August. Opening statements began the week of August 17th, and the proceedings, expected to run roughly a month, are being covered by outlets including CNN and NBC News. Knight, as one of the few living people who was physically present in the car that night, is guaranteed to be referenced throughout the trial even though he isn't a defendant in this case. Whatever testimony and evidence surfaces over the coming weeks could reshape decades of public assumptions about that shooting. And Knight will almost certainly weigh in on his own podcast as it unfolds, the same way he's used every other major hip-hop headline for material over the past 2 years. The financial picture behind all of this is its own kind of collapse. At Death Row's commercial peak in the 1990s, the label was generating hundreds of millions of dollars, built on albums like Dr. Dre's The Chronic, Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, and Tupac's All Eyes on Me. Knight and the label filed for bankruptcy in 2006, citing debts exceeding $100 million after a costly legal judgment from former business partners Lydia and Michael Harris. Death Row's assets, its master recordings and publishing rights, were auctioned off in 2009 for $24 million to a company called Global Music Group, and the label has changed hands multiple times since, eventually landing through a chain of corporate acquisitions under the ownership structure connected to Snoop Dogg, who has publicly discussed his own long-term plans for the brand. Knight, by every account, doesn't see a cent of that. Financial estimates of his current net worth vary widely across public reporting, with some placing it in the low hundreds of thousands and others describing it as deeply negative once outstanding legal debts and old tax liabilities are factored in. What's consistent across nearly all of that reporting is the scale of the fall. A man once tied to a 9-figure fortune now has essentially no meaningful financial footprint left outside of prison. So what does an actual week look like for him right now? It's medication schedules for diabetes management. It's navigating a facility with reduced vision in one eye. It's structured meals and limited yard time inside a medium to maximum security institution that, according to CDCR's own description of the facility, houses inmates identified as having elevated medical or mental health needs. And then, somewhere inside that routine, it's a phone call to Dave Mays and his production team, turned into another half-hour episode that gets uploaded to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube for an audience that includes plenty of listeners who weren't even alive during Death Row's 1990s peak. For a lot of those younger listeners, Knight isn't a nostalgic figure tied to a golden era. He's simply an opinionated older voice weighing in on current hip-hop controversies, discovered fresh through a podcast feed with no particular reverence attached to the mythology around him. It's worth remembering how far Knight actually fell to get here, because the distance is part of what makes the current routine so stark. Before Death Row, Knight had been an undrafted defensive end who briefly made an NFL roster with the Los Angeles Rams during the 1987 players' strike, a short athletic career that never went anywhere close to where his business career eventually took him. He co-founded Death Row Records in 1991, and within a few years the label had become the commercial center of West Coast hip-hop, releasing a run of albums that are still treated as genre-defining decades later. Reporting from that era consistently describes Knight functioning as executive, manager, and enforcer all at once, someone whose aggressive reputation was, by multiple accounts, part of what protected the label's business interests during its most volatile years. That same reputation, though, fed directly into the criminal record that would later make his manslaughter sentence longer than it would otherwise have been. The armed robbery and assault convictions from the 1990s are exactly what triggered the third strike enhancement that added 6 years onto his current sentence. In a real sense, the qualities that helped build the empire are the same qualities that guaranteed he'd eventually lose both it and his freedom. Family has stayed mostly outside the spotlight of Knight's current media presence, which is notable given how much attention his podcast draws elsewhere. Public records identify several children connected to Knight from different relationships, but unlike his commentary on other artists and executives, he's rarely used Collect Call as a venue to discuss his own family life in detail, and there's little independently reported information about regular visitation or ongoing relationships with his children during his incarceration. What has surfaced publicly are more emotional, unscripted moments, including at least one episode where Knight spoke about his mother and grew visibly emotional discussing her, a rare glimpse of vulnerability on a show that's mostly built around confrontation and old grievances. On the production side, Collect Call is a genuinely professional operation, not a hobbyist project. Breakbeat Media, Mays' company, has credited a full team behind the show, including executive producers, audio engineers, and original music composed specifically for the series. Episodes have carried sponsorships from consumer finance and gaming apps, the same kind of advertising a main